So, guys, I do want to talk about the wrestler R-Truth. And, over a year ago, I've done some videos talk about my feelings about R-Truth. And I've said things like, he is kind of like a racial stereotype. And I've also said other things too on another video where I took some more thought about what people were saying to my video and said that, there's a difference between being a racial stereotype and being yourself, really. And then also, too, when you pick point anybody and any entertainer and how anybody comes off, you can always associate them with stereotypes or not. For example, like Timeless Tony Storm, she fits. A lot of people like her as a professional wrestler, and she's been like, talked about as this big feminist wrestler because she's having a lot of great matches. She's doing a bunch of hardcore stuff, but she acts like, but one person can dissect her character and say, like, okay, she goes around kissing other women. That's a stereotype that lesbian women are hypersexualized. She acts all like, crazy and narcissistic because she's inspired by like old Hollywood. So one could say that she's a crazy white woman. And also, she makes a lot of sexual comedy. So she kind of goes into that stereotype of like how white women are not, are sexually crazy, really, like Lois Griffin and other things like that. So you can always dissect any human being and what they do, especially entertainers and professional wrestlers and what they do, and say, hey, that is a stereotype, and other things like that. So I do want to say with R-Truth, wholeheartedly, after years of thinking about this, the man is himself, really. So, he does comedy very well. He's into rap. He's into dancing. He does all that stuff, really. So, just to say that he's like a house slave or he's an ethnic stereotype, I don't think that that's right, really, because the other issue is, what would happen if there was somebody backstage who was like politically correct and was like, hey, or somebody in the WWE Human Resources that says, hey, R-Truth has to be fired because he dances, because he raps, because he's too funny, because he never wins championships, because that fits all black stereotypes. We're going to run to a world where it's going to be like politically correct racism, where it's like black people have to behave a certain way, white people have to behave a certain way. Everybody can't be, stereotypes. There is a difference between being a stereotype and being yourself, really. And I think that the ultimate difference is a personal choice. For example, if Vince McMahon was like, hey, R-Truth, you know what? I want you to rap. I want you to do all these things, really, and never really win. And R-Truth was like, no, that's not how I want to do my character. Then R-Truth agrees to it for money. Then that's essentially, him selling out to being a racial stereotype. And I don't think that's what happened to him. But I also think that then you have to look at companies and be like, hey, you know what? Now there's an issue here with the company being racist. So, and as I said, like, I think that when I was younger, I looked at him as a racial stereotype because, and I don't mind even saying this, I was very insecure about my race. Like, I'm actually mixed race. I'm part black, part Native American, part white. I grew up in a white family that wanted me to be their black kid. I grew up in a lot of neighborhoods with a lot of white people. And I dealt with lots of racism throughout my life. And then I also will confess that I've had a lot of traumatic experiences around African Americans. My mother was black and Native American. She was physically abusive and emotionally abusive and neglectful. I went to a summer camp when I was like 8 years old, and I got abused by my camp counselors, physically abused. I went to the inner city in New York City. I was bullied a lot by people who were black. Then I remember like going to high school, and I was like the only like black kid, and I'm mixed race. I'm telling people I'm mixed race, but I was kind of like the token black guy. Like, oh well, there's Byron, he's black. Oh, that's why Byron sits in front of the bus. He's doing that for Rosa Parks. And I really worked hard to say I'm mixed race, I'm mixed race, I'm mixed race. But no, I was like a black kid, and I've actually remember like sometimes when, because I've had psychological issues, that sometimes my dad would sign my doctor paperwork and my psychological evaluations, and each time I put down like white, black, or other, he would cross out and put down BLACK, black, because in my parents' mind, I was always their black child, and that's kind of messed up when you live in a white family that wants you to be their black child, really, when you're mixed race, again, that's really, really messed up. Like, my dad is bald, and he has big glasses, So should I say, oh well, he's a Jew because there's a stereotype that Jews have either like the long beards or big glasses, or sometimes Jews are bald and stuff like that. He wouldn't really like that if I was saying, oh, well, you must be a Jew because of that. Or my dad has blonde hair and blue eyes. But my dad's Italian. So should I say, oh well, you must be German because there's a stereotype that all white people with blonde hair and blue eyes are from Nazi Germany, or they're part of the Aryan race? Or should I assume that my dad's a white supremacist because he's a white man with blonde hair and blue eyes and a bald head? Really, you can't just look at somebody's skin complexion and say that's a black guy, or that's a white guy, or that's an Aryan, or whatever. Really, So I grew up with a lot of racism, so I felt very insecure when I've seen like R-Truth and other like black entertainers, because I'm like, well, everybody's thinking that I'm the same way, really. Like I remember like in high school, I got in trouble multiple times, really. Like I remember like I used to be a really big Uncle Tom. Then one time, people wanted me to be this like black stereotype, so I used to like carry around knives. I used to like, I used to have like I used to be in advanced placement classes, do very well, and I used to like fail this class because I assumed that that's what black men are supposed to do, really. I remember like, one time in high school there was this skit on domestic violence, and I remember like, I did it with my girlfriend, so I remember throwing up a chair. I remember grabbing her and threatening to smack her. And two things I said was like, sometimes my dad like does that type of raise his hand and threatens to smack me. So I was using that, method acting, using my life a little bit. And I also said too, to my teacher, I'm part black, and that's how black men get down. Black men love to beat their women, because I had so much like self-hate and stuff, and I was wrong for doing that. And that was a horrible thing to say because, again, there's plenty of people of all races that have domestic violence issues. You look at Japan, there's a huge issue of Japanese people abusing women. It's not just, black people, so you can't make that argument. You cannot make that argument it's that, certain stereotypes stick within one race, really. I remember when I went to college, I dealt with a lot of racism there. Like I remember like somebody saying to me, what kind of fucking nigger works that hard? Because I used to like, I had 4 or 5 jobs. I remember like, I used to work close to 20 hours a day, really. And I was kind of like looked at as a freak show in college because African Americans don't fit that mold of being hard workers, And then I also had professors like Tony Whedon, Dan Towner, Tyrone Shaw use the word nigger in their classrooms. I remember like one time my professor Tony Whedon, and I'll use his name, he once said to his classroom, like I remember like one time I was late and he said, oh, how's it going, black student, black man? This is like the first day we worked together. He used the word niggard, Niggard, when you don't use that word because that sounds like the word nigger. Another time he asked us like an example of a psychological thriller in writing, and I said The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, and then he said, what about The Nigger of the Narcissus? The Nigger of the Narcissus is a book by Joseph Conrad, for those who don't know, because back then calling black people a nigger was politically correct, really. So yeah, and here's a copy of it, because I would like to read that book and see what it's about. But the point of it is, that through my life, psychologically, I felt very insecure with black entertainers because I always felt like, hey, you know what? When R-Truth dances, when he shucks and jives and does all that stuff, everybody's gonna say, hey, that's Byron. Like whatever he does, I do. When O.J. Simpson committed murder in the 1990s, there were some people giving me some looks like, oh, well, even though I was like 8 or 9 years old, oh, well, that's how you get down. You're a murderer because, when a black guy murders somebody on television, that's how all black men are, really. I did grow up in a lot of white communities like that. Or when Obama was president, I'll say that. One of the reasons why I lost my virginity was because I looked a little bit like Obama back then. But there was also that thing, too, of a lot of white women in my college and in my community on dating sites that were like, what? Well, Obama is president. We want our black men. We want our black beasts. So I've gone through a lot of just, racism throughout my life with that. And then when I see black people like R-Truth, I feel very insecure because of a lot of the racism I've been through. And I'll continue it a little further. When I graduated college, I did a competition called the 48-hour film project. I remember the first year I did it for the New Haven 48. People were pointing their fingers at me and saying like, "Hey, it's great that a black guy is doing the competition." And then I also remember some people saying at the 48 event, "Hey Byron, patting me on the shoulder really hard. Why don't you want to work with me? Is that black people want to work with other black people?" And as I said, every single time I've mentioned this to Mark Rupert, the president of the competition, he says nothing about it. He does nothing. He overlooks it. And I remember, like, I've told the story where I got accused of harassment, but they didn't address the racial harassment that happened to me, really. And there was a city producer that almost put me on a probationary period. They said the wrong information to somebody. And I almost got like arrested for trespassing to an event that I was volunteering for because this city producer that I had an issue with lied to that city producer about what my disciplinary action was. So, and then this city producer that I had an issue with on the news, they were on the news for doing discrimination and stealing money and other things from their city hall job in downtown New Haven. So in my life, I've encountered severe racism. There was a time I was almost murdered by the police in 2010, really, because my job was robbed by its own security guards. I thought about suicide for many, many years, and I was told to suck it up and move it on. Like, as I said, if I was a white girl and I was almost attacked by a black man, I think my father would have got me therapy and pressed charges against the job, really, if that hypothetical happened. If I was a white girl and I was attacked by a black man, or almost attacked by a black man. But, me being a mixed race person that's considered black, oh, well, suck it up. You've been through nothing. And I worked with a therapist who once said, Byron, you've not been through anything traumatic. And also my therapist said something like, you know what, work hard, don't become another black man going to jail, really. And I've corrected my therapist many times that I'm actually mixed race, not black, really. So, and I worked at a psych ward, so sometimes I'd hear patients say, even little kids say to me, I want to kill you, you fucking nigger. I want to kill you, you nigger. I want to kill you, nigger. Nigger, nigger, nigger all the time, really. So through my life, everything I'm saying, like, I've had an amalgamation of so much racism happening to me. So when I see people like R-Truth, it does bring up some shame and embarrassment because I'm like, oh man, now everybody's going to think I'm like him, really. But I've learned a lot over time, really. You got to be yourself, really. And when R-Truth dances and raps and does all that cool stuff, really, you know what? That's not representative of me. That's a representative of himself, really. And ultimately, I think he likes doing it. I think he wants to do it. And that's the big difference. If that's who he wants to be, that's who he wants to be. The same way, I like traveling, so I'm not responsible with my money. So I can fit the stereotype of how black people are bad with money. I live on my brother's couch, really. I'm close to 40 years old. I live on my brother's couch. I pay like $300 worth of rent. There's a stereotype that black people are freeloader or avoid responsibility. There's been many, many times where I've been picked, where I met black homeless people or black homeless women, sticking their cups at me, begging for change, and I don't give them anything the same way I don't give change to other people. So there's also that stereotype that I follow of, how some black men will not help black women if even if it's financially. One of the reasons why many people don't do that is because, you don't want to be taken advantage of. So there are things that I do in my life that can befit black stereotypes, but we can't just look at people like R-Truth and be like, hey, you know what, this man, we can analyze R-Truth and we can analyze any professional wrestler and say, hey, this person's a stereotype or not. But I think in general, you got to be proud of who you are. And then also you got to be like, no matter what life you live, look at people for people, really. As I said before, and I'll say it again, if R-Truth comes on camera or he talks to Ariel Helwani, he says things like, oh, well, they forced me to shuck and jive. They never really believed in me and all these other things. And I can kind of maybe more understand that he's a racial stereotype, but that was forced upon him. Or if there is something like, if something comes out like he wants to do all the, like people said, oh, well, you can be this way, that way. And he's like, nah, I want to just be a black fool or whatever. Like if he says those words, then he's being a racial stereotype for the sake of being a racial stereotype. So you have to get to know people really, really clearly before you kind of judge if they're being a racial stereotype or not. But ultimately, like I said, I wish R-Truth the best. He is definitely, and like as I said, like it is amazing that he survived in WWE for, I think like almost 20 years because I'm counting the 17 years that he was there, and then also he was there during the Attitude for a couple of years before he went to TNA Wrestling. Just like Dolph Ziggler, there's a lot of people on that roster who survived, like almost close to 2 decades and other things like that, really, and who's done a lot of great work, really. So, I mean, it's unfortunately lost his job. For the fans who are cheering, we want truth, we want truth. Keep doing that, because they can always bring him back and whatever, you know. Or you never know. AEW can have a use for him, as long as he's getting that paycheck. But the thing about it is that when I look at our truth, in 2025 with a lot more maturity and emotional intelligence, I would say that yes, he made me very embarrassed and insecure because of the racism that I've dealt with throughout my life. But as an older and wiser man, really, I can say, hey, you know what? There's a difference between a person who is forced to be a racial stereotype, a person who's choosing to be a racial stereotype, and a person who's saying, hey, you know what? I'm into this thing. I'm into comedy. I'm into dancing. I'm into rapping. I'm into just, having fun and maybe not going as far as I want to with heavyweight championships. I'm just there to be there as an entertainer. If that's who he wants to be, that's not being a racial stereotype. That's him being himself, really. And everybody should have the right to be themselves.